for chapter 5 is going to cover, it's going to be a quick introduction and Newton's first law. So first off, Newtonian dynamics. So we spent the last couple chapters talking about how things move. So now we move on to why they move. So why do objects accelerate? So why do they move like they do? And that's called dynamics. So when you put together the kinematics, the how things move, and the dynamics, why things move, that's called mechanics. And we're going to be looking at a particular approach to mechanics due to Isaac Newton. So mechanics then, it's a complete description of motion, so the kinematics and the dynamics, so the how and the why, and everything's going to be summarized into Newton's 3 laws of motion, which we'll introduce one at a time. Alright, so first off, let's start with Newton's first law. So Newton's first law, well, there's lots of different ways you can state Newton's first law. One says every body continues in its state of rest or of uniform motion in a straight line unless it is compelled to change that state by forces impressed on it. So maybe that makes sense, maybe it doesn't, so there's another way that we can actually phrase that might be a little clearer, and that is to say that every object in a uniform state of motion tends to remain in that state of motion until an external force is applied to it. Alright, so what are really the implications of Newton's first law? So, and just a little background here, so Newton's first law is also sometimes called the law of inertia, and Newton didn't really come up with it. It was actually Galileo, who was like the late 16th century, early 17th century. Yeah, interestingly enough, legend has it that Newton was actually born on the same day that Galileo died. So, but what the important thing and what Newton's first law really means is that no force is necessary to keep an object in motion. So if you have an object moving, it'll continue in a constant velocity, so it'll move at a constant speed in a straight line unless there's some external force applied to it. Now, of course, in our everyday experience, may seem kind of strange because we're used to if you give an object a push, it'll move for a little while, but eventually it'll come to a stop. But typically the reason things come to a stop is because there is an external force, namely the force of friction. So friction always opposes motion, so it tends to make things stop. So, and this is actually where, and this is sort of in the history of physics, this was kind of a big deal, this law of inertia, because this was really one of the first breaks from Aristotle's ideas about moving objects. So Aristotle was one of the famous Greek philosophers in the 4th century BCE, and Aristotle basically said that, well, most objects here on Earth have want to be at rest. So if you don't do anything, they will eventually end up in their natural state, which is at rest. So, and Galileo is really the first person to challenge this idea.